At exactly 3 in the morning, I got the call. Not a text, not a missed notification, a real call. And not from a friend, not even from a client. It was my father. "Ava," he said, his voice tight, urgent, breathless. "Your apartment building is on fire. It's on the news. Are you okay? Please tell me you're not inside." I looked around the darkened room. I was lying on the old office couch in my clinic, surrounded by papers, patient files, notes, photos, evidence, and silence. And then, God help me, I laughed. Not a soft chuckle, not one of those nervous giggles people do when they don't know how to react. No. This was loud, from my gut, the kind of laugh that makes your eyes water and your ribs ache, the kind of laugh that makes the person on the other end of the phone go absolutely silent. "Ava," he said again, confused. "Why are you laughing? Everything's gone." I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater. "That building," I said, voice still shaky, "was never just my home, Dad. And it wasn't. It was the container for something they didn't want seen, something they thought they could burn into ash, something I had been getting too close to. But they had no idea. They had no idea who they just set on fire. My name is Dr. Ava Reynolds. I'm 35 years old, a licensed trauma therapist, based in Atlanta, and for the last decade, I've worked with survivors of religious abuse, people who've been silenced, shamed, or spiritually manipulated by the very institutions that claim to protect them. I know how to listen for patterns. I know how to spot gaslighting from 50 feet away. And I never, ever forget the sound of a lie. What happened that night wasn't just an accident. It wasn't faulty wiring. It wasn't some random spark. That fire was a cover-up. And that laugh was the moment I realized they made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because the files they wanted gone, the patient records, the statements, the evidence, they weren't in that building. They were with me. Right here, stacked on the table behind me, organized in folders, labeled by date, untouched by flame. I should probably back up for a second. You need to understand how I got here, why I lived in that building, why they wanted it, and what it was really hiding. You see, I didn't grow up in Atlanta. I grew up in a small town in Alabama. You've probably driven past a dozen places like it, quiet streets, well-kept lawns, and a church on every corner. Faith wasn't just a weekend thing in our house. It was law. And my older brother, he wasn't just admired. He was worshipped. Caleb Reynolds, Reverend, visionary, the next Billy Graham, people whispered. He had charisma. He had charm. He had a God-given gift for making people believe, including our parents, especially them. Me, I was the quiet one, the good student, the shadow in the corner. Until I wasn't. Until I told someone what I'd seen behind Caleb's charm, what he'd said, what he'd done. And they told me I was confused, that I was bitter, that I was just seeking attention. So I left. At 18, I packed 2 bags and bought a bus ticket to Atlanta. I worked night shifts, got scholarships, clawed my way into grad school, and by 28, I opened my first therapy office. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I specialized in faith-based trauma. Survivors found me through whispers, referrals, support groups. We met in that quiet room on the 2nd floor of an old building downtown. No signage, no logo, just a buzzer and a name on a mailbox, Reynolds Counseling. Ironic, isn't it? The name that silenced so many was now the one helping them speak. The building was owned by a nonprofit called Grace Coalition. I thought it was just an old Christian charity helping lease buildings to small community groups like mine. I didn't know the board of trustees had changed. I didn't know my brother sat on it now. I didn't know the building had been quietly sold 3 months before the fire. I should have seen the signs. The repair delays, the surprise inspections, The strange men with expensive shoes and clipboards asking questions they shouldn't know how to ask. But I was too focused on my work, too tired, too trusting. And then, boom, 3 a.m., fire alarms blaring, sirens, people on the street screaming, and my father's voice on the phone telling me my life was up in smoke. But he was wrong. Because what I had built, it couldn't be burned down. And now they were going to wish I had been asleep in that building. Because what they tried to destroy was the exact thing that made me dangerous. I had the truth. And the truth doesn't burn. So before I take you any further, before I tell you what I uncovered, who helped me, and how far this thing really went, do me a favor. Stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why I didn't scream that night. I laughed. And when you hear what they did, you might laugh too. But not because it's funny, because it's over for them. And it's just beginning for me. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on the edge of that couch in my office, blankets still twisted around me. My phone still buzzing from friends who saw the fire on the news. Most messages said the same thing. Are you okay? Was anyone hurt? Do you need a place to stay? But what no one asked was the one question that mattered most to me. Do you think this was on purpose? Because even before the smoke had cleared, I already knew. This wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't faulty wiring or a careless neighbor. It was too clean, too convenient, too quiet. But to understand why I was so certain, you have to understand where I came from. And more importantly, who I came from. I was born into a family where image was everything. In our town, the Reynolds name meant respect, faith, purity. We sat in the same pew every Sunday. My father served as an elder. My mother played piano during altar calls. And my brother. Caleb was the rising star. He was 5 years older than me, and from the moment he could speak, people called him anointed. He led youth groups before he had a driver's license, sermons by 16, a full congregation by 23. Women adored him, men admired him, and absolutely no one questioned him. Except me. I was the one who noticed the cracks. The stories that didn't line up. The girls who left church quietly and never returned. The youth volunteers who started with fire and ended in silence. When I finally asked questions, my mother said, "Be careful what you suggest," accusing someone like Caleb that could ruin his life. But what about the lives he'd already ruined? No one wanted to hear that. So I shut up. I smiled. I played the obedient daughter, the quiet shadow. I counted down the days until I could leave. And when I finally did, I swore I'd never go back. But it turns out, you can leave the building and still carry the foundation. I became a therapist to help others heal from exactly the kind of damage I'd seen growing up. I didn't plan to specialize in religious trauma. It found me. One client turned into 5, then 10, then a waiting list of people who all said the same thing. I thought it was just me. It didn't feel like abuse, because it came wrapped in scripture. I didn't think anyone would believe me. And I did believe them, because I had lived it. My office became more than just a clinic. It became a safe house for truth. The building itself wasn't much to look at. Old brick, bad lighting, leaky roof. But the rooms were quiet. The neighbors were kind. And Grace Coalition offered affordable rent to nonprofits. Or so I thought. I'd heard of Grace before. It started as a faith-based charity that helped low-income tenants and small community services find affordable space. They owned dozens of buildings across Atlanta. Quiet, low profile, seemed harmless. Until 3 months before the fire. That's when they started selling. Quietly, strategically, building by building, always under a different name, always to developers with ties to city officials. But none of that had reached me yet. Not until the inspector came. I remember the day he walked in. A Monday. Cold, rainy. I had back-to-back clients, and the receptionist was out sick, so when the buzzer rang, I answered it myself. He wore a navy suit, polished shoes, no clipboard, no ID badge. "Are you the tenant of Suite B?" "Depends. Who's asking?" He smiled like a politician. "Just here for a quick assessment. City ordinance. Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes." Something about the way he moved bothered me. Too confident. Too familiar. But I had a full lobby, so I let him in. He didn't check the wiring, didn't measure anything. He just looked around, nodded to himself, glanced at the patient files on my desk and said, "Do you have backup copies of these?" I stared at him. Why would that matter? He shrugged. "Sometimes buildings like this don't last. Always good to be prepared." Then he left. I never saw him again. A week later, someone tried to get into the building at night. The keypad was pried open. Nothing was stolen. But the locks had been changed. Another week passed. A neighbor told me the building had a new owner. "Grace sold it," she said, "to a private development group. Big money guys." I didn't believe her at first. No one told me. No notice. No paperwork. No updated lease. But then strange things started happening. The maintenance team disappeared. The heating system started shutting down randomly. 2 tenants received eviction notices. One had lived there for over 20 years. And yet, none of us could figure out who to call. No property manager, no real estate listing, just a post office box in Buckhead and a disconnected number. That's when I called my father. Not because I trusted him, but because I knew he'd know how to read between the lines. He was an accountant, clean, by the book, retired now, but sharp as ever. "Dad," I said, "something's off." He sighed. "Have you finally gotten insurance?" "That's not what I'm calling about." "Well, it should be." That was always his answer. Insurance, backups, safety nets. And maybe he had a point. But this wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about what I had inside that building. Because over the past year, I had been compiling something. Not just patient notes, but patterns, connections. I had found over a dozen abuse survivors, different churches, different cities, but all with links to the same group of pastors. And at the top of that list, Caleb Reynolds, my brother. The building wasn't just my home or my office. It was a vault, a fortress for stories they thought no one would believe. And now, it was gone. Up in smoke? Or so they thought. The night of the fire, I stood across the street, staring at everything I thought was solid, now glowing red and crumbling. Fire crews worked like clockwork. Water sprayed from the hoses in wide arcs. Smoke poured out from the upper floors, and people huddled in blankets, faces hollow and wet. My building, my home, my clinic, my records was falling in on itself. And I just stood there, still in paint-stained sweats, hair pulled into a tired bun, hands shaking, but not from fear. From fury. The flames danced where my life used to be. But the thing I kept thinking was, how fast it all happened. Too fast. Fires don't spread like that in brick buildings unless something fuels them. And I knew that place. I knew the walls, the wiring, the layout. I'd memorized every inch of it. That fire wasn't natural. It wasn't accidental. It was controlled. It was planned. The next morning, the fire marshal made a statement. The blaze likely started in a utility closet on the 3rd floor. Faulty circuits. Perhaps. We'll investigate further. Utility closet. That closet had been locked for months. I tried to access it last fall when the heat failed. The landlord said it was under contractor control. No one ever followed up. Now it was the epicenter of a 5-alarm fire. And still no owner came forward. No building manager. No spokesperson, no apology, only silence. Until someone knocked on the temporary shelter door. Her name was Eliza Burke. Black pantsuit, glossy hair, clipboard in hand. She introduced herself with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I represent the current property holders," she said. "Northgate Developments, a subsidiary of Grace Coalition." Subsidiary. I blinked. When did that happen? She didn't flinch. "Ownership transitioned a few months ago. Our records show you were leasing under outdated terms. We're here to assist with transitional options." Transitional options. She meant relocation. She meant hush money. She meant wiping their hands clean. I asked her, "Did you know there were patients being treated in that building? That private health data may have been destroyed?" She paused, just enough to register surprise, or maybe satisfaction. "I'm sure proper protocols were followed," she replied calmly. "In any case, our legal team will be in touch." I didn't wait. That same day, I contacted Derek Sullivan, a journalist I'd met briefly during a community event. Young, skeptical, obsessed with local corruption. I sent him one message: "I think a church just burned down my office to hide what was inside." He replied 5 minutes later, "Tell me everything." We met the next day at a coffee shop. I brought copies of the survivor statements, redacted names, patterns of behavior, financial links to Caleb's church network, timeline breakdowns of the building's ownership transfer, everything I'd been too scared to act on before the fire. Now I had nothing left to lose. Derek listened, his pen racing. "This is bigger than your clinic," he said finally. "Way bigger." I nodded. "Then we blow it up." Not literally, of course, but I wanted this story everywhere. No more silence. No more whispered confessions behind therapy doors. No more protection for the powerful. We started mapping out the connections. Grace Coalition wasn't just a nonprofit. It was a front, a veil. Behind it were layers of shell companies, land purchases, lobbying records, donation trails, churches acquiring property, jacking up rent, displacing tenants, all under the claim of community service. And every time a tenant resisted, somehow, a fire happened. We found 4 others in the past 2 years. 4 buildings, 3 fires, 1 mysterious gas leak. All ruled inconclusive by investigators. All buildings sold shortly before the incidents. All now owned by private religious-affiliated developers. It was a pattern. But to make it stick, we needed proof. And for that, we needed people. Real people. Witnesses. Survivors. So I started reaching out. I called the clients who had already left the city. I texted those who had shared stories off the record. I reconnected with women who once told me, "I'm not ready to go public." Now they were... Because the fire did more than destroy my apartment. It burned away fear. It gave people clarity, urgency. We weren't just hurt. We were hunted. One client, I'll call her Maria, had a folder of voicemails from Caleb's church administrator. "If you tell anyone, you'll lose your place in the congregation. Your children will be expelled from school. God doesn't protect traitors." Another had photographs. Another still had receipts, donations made under duress. Gifts given to leadership in exchange for silence. It all pointed in the same direction. And when Derek began publishing excerpts masked, legally cautious, but powerful, the internet did what it does best. It amplified. By the end of that week, our inboxes were overflowing. Anonymous tips, new whistleblowers, lawyers wanting to help, even a few reporters from major networks asking for comment. That's when my brother called me. Caleb's voice was smooth, as always. "Ava," he said, "this is not the way to handle your pain." I laughed into the receiver, a short, dry laugh this time. "You think this is about pain?" He sighed. "You're acting emotional, reckless. You need to stop before someone gets hurt." "Someone already did," I wanted to say. I did. They did. But instead, I said, "You should start praying, Caleb, because I haven't even started yet." Then I hung up, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years. Power. Not rage. Not fear. Just the steady heat of power. The same kind they tried to burn out of me. The same kind they saw as a threat. But the thing about power, you don't have to scream it. You just have to use it. There's a moment in every story where the hero hits the wall. For me, it came 48 hours after the fire. I was alone in a borrowed studio, surrounded by ashes, literal and emotional. My body ached from exhaustion. My phone was nearly dead. And my bank account, it couldn't handle another week in limbo. The smell of smoke had followed me everywhere. It clung to my hair, my skin, even my dreams. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. I just kept replaying the fire, the whistleblowers, Caleb's voice on the phone telling me to stop. And part of me, God, I hate admitting this, but part of me almost listened. Because there's a kind of grief that doesn't look like tears. It looks like surrender, quiet, numb, a slow fading. That's where I was headed, until my father showed up. I didn't invite him. He didn't ask. He just knocked on the door and walked in like he had every right to. He looked tired, but sharp. Like a man who had been watching everything unfold and decided it was time to stop watching. He sat down across from me. No preamble, no small talk. Just said, "Do you want to fight them or survive them?" I looked up, confused. What's the difference? He said, "Surviving means rebuilding quietly. Fighting means taking them down with you. One costs time. The other costs everything." I didn't answer right away. He waited. Then, without warning, I reached into my bag and pulled out a flash drive. It held every file I'd salvaged. Survivor stories, church documents, financial records, photographs, audio recordings. I slid it across the table. "If I'm going down," I told him, "they're coming with me." He didn't flinch. He picked up the drive, looked at it like it weighed 50 pounds. Then he said, "All right, let's make a plan." And just like that, we became a team. The artist and the accountant. The survivor and the skeptic. We started by mapping out the network. Grace Coalition wasn't just laundering faith, they were laundering money. Their donations filtered through fake charities, shell companies, and real estate fronts. My father, bless his dry, methodical brain, found the cracks faster than I could keep up. "This building," he said, circling a line on a printout, was purchased by a holding company 3 weeks before the fire. But the holding company is owned by a trust, and the trustee is your brother's legal advisor. Every document he touched turned into a thread, and those threads led to contracts, invoices, leases, and inspection reports. He even found something I missed: 2 signed permit requests to demolish my clinic, both submitted before the fire. They'd planned this, down to the week, and they thought no one would notice. But now we had dates, names, financial trails, digital footprints, a paper trail of arrogance. Still, evidence means nothing without leverage. So we started gathering people. Derek connected us with tenant rights lawyers. I reached out to national survivors networks. A few brave former church staffers stepped forward quietly, carefully. One woman handed over a folder marked, "For court." If I disappear. Inside were transcripts, screenshots, threats, bank transfers, enough to build a skeleton case. But we needed muscle. So I called Sophia. She was the gallery owner who'd once hosted my art therapy showcase. She had connections, space, a mailing list of people who cared about more than just pretty pictures. "I want to build something," I told her, "an installation, something no one can ignore." She didn't ask questions. She just said, "When do you want to open?" And that's how it began. While Dad worked on tracing money, I started collecting ruins. Charred wood from my old office. Melted frames, water-damaged journals, half-burned prayer cards, anything that told the story of what was lost. But I didn't just want to show pain. I wanted to show rage. I wanted people to walk into that gallery and feel exactly what we felt: confusion, fear, betrayal, and then resolve. Every room would represent a stage of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally justice. We called it Sanctuary Burned. But the real fire hadn't even started yet. 2 weeks into planning, Eliza Burke returned. This time she wasn't smiling. She came with an offer: $5,000, she said, as a gesture of goodwill, plus a housing voucher, plus legal immunity if I agreed not to pursue further action. I told her to leave. She leaned forward, her voice low. "You're a therapist, Miss Reynolds, not a warrior. These things get messy." I met her stare. I treat survivors. I've lived through fire. Messy is my home language. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and said, "Careful, you don't want to become unstable in the public eye." And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just about property. This was about control. They were still trying to frame me, paint me as emotional, irrational, dangerous. The woman who laughs at her building burning down. The unstable therapist with a personal vendetta. But what they didn't know was that I had backup now. A father who once called me reckless now sent me spreadsheets every night at midnight. A journalist who once covered local noise ordinances now ran a series called "Holy Smoke, the Churches That Burn Down Buildings." And a community that once whispered their pain in private now handed me their stories like torches. I wasn't alone. And I wasn't unstable. I was ready. So when my brother showed up unannounced outside the gallery dressed in his Sunday best, flanked by lawyers, I didn't blink. He tried to reason, said I was dividing the family, that I should consider forgiveness, that the kingdom is under attack. I looked him in the eye and said, "Then maybe the kingdom needs to burn." They thought the fire they started would erase me. But all it really did was make room for the one I was about to light. And this time, I wasn't going to hide in shadows or wait for permission. I was done surviving. It was time to retaliate. Quietly, publicly, completely. We started with the installation. The gallery space Sophia lent us was cold, industrial, raw, exposed beams, cement floors, high ceilings that echoed even the softest sound. Perfect. I built it room by room. The entry was a reconstruction of my old office burnt furniture, blackened door frames, the smell of scorched insulation. I recreated it from memory using salvaged debris and donated materials. But the centerpiece was the file cabinet. It stood tall in the center of the room, melted on one side, empty drawers hanging open. Above it hung a single light bulb, and on the wall behind it, projected testimonies, anonymous quotes from real survivors typed in white against black. I told the pastor what happened. He said I should pray harder. My parents blamed me. They called it spiritual discipline. I called it fear. And the final quote: "No one believed me until her." That last one wasn't mine. It was Maria's. And I nearly cried the first time I saw it glowing on that gallery wall. By the time opening night came, word had spread. Local reporters, former clients, advocacy groups, and even strangers from the community who'd followed the fire on the news all showed up. And in the middle of it all was Caleb, standing near the exit, watching, waiting. He didn't speak to me. He didn't have to. Because 10 minutes later, a man in a tailored suit approached with a card. "David Mercer," he said, "Legal Affairs for Northgate Development." He glanced at the installation, lips tight. "You've made quite a statement." I nodded. "Good." Then he said, "We're prepared to make a much larger offer this time, something that could help you move forward." I tilted my head. How large? $100,000. That number hit the air like a brick. $100,000. Enough to start over, get a new office, pay off debt, launch a new practice somewhere far from all of this. But he kept talking. In exchange, he said, we'd like a full non-disclosure agreement. You'd cease all public commentary, remove this exhibit, and— No, I said, cutting him off. I don't need to hear the rest. He smiled politely. I encourage you to think carefully. Reputation is currency in your line of work. I stepped closer. So is courage. Then I turned away. The next morning, Sophia told me the entire exchange had been caught on camera by 3 different attendees. And by noon, it was viral. Clips of our conversation were posted everywhere, under hashtags like #SanctuaryBurned, #TherapistVsDevelopers, and #FaithOnFire. Comments flooded in. Some were cruel, accusatory, predictable. But most, supportive, angry, inspired. And best of all, loud. People were finally talking. About housing injustice. About spiritual abuse. About women being silenced. About power structures hiding behind faith. And for the first time since the fire, I felt visible. But the war wasn't just emotional. It was financial, legal, political. And that's where Dad came in. While I was working on public exposure, he was working on private collapse. He traced Northgate's financial records, found ghost companies, inflated invoices, inspection reports that had been rubber-stamped by city officials with ties to Caleb's board. Then he followed the money further straight into a real estate fund backed by wealthy church donors, some of whom had no idea what their money was supporting. So he called them, and when that didn't work, he wrote a formal complaint to the SEC. Meanwhile, Derek dug deeper into fire reports. He found that demolition permits had been filed for our building 3 weeks before the fire, and construction plans for luxury condos had been approved 1 week before the fire. How could they plan to build something on land that hadn't even burned yet? Unless they knew. Unless they were the ones holding the match. We brought everything to our lawyer, Josephine Alvarez. She reviewed it all, then looked at me and said, "This is enough to launch a formal civil case, maybe even open a criminal one." But she warned us they'll fight. Dirty, with delays, countersuits, smear campaigns. I told her, let them. And they did. Within 2 days, my name was slandered in anonymous op-eds, unstable therapist with a political agenda, questionable history with church leadership, possibly retaliatory. Someone even leaked fake patient reviews online. But I wasn't the only one being attacked. Derek got calls from blocked numbers, warning him to back off. My dad's old clients began receiving letters encouraging them to question his ethics. And one night, I came home to find my front door unlocked. Nothing stolen, just disturbed. Someone had been inside. That shook me more than anything. Not because I was scared, but because it meant we were close. They were feeling the heat. And when predators feel cornered, they lash out, which only proved our point. The next day, I launched the second phase of the installation, an interactive timeline. Dates, photos, maps, receipts, everything we'd uncovered. Visitors could scan QR codes and read real documentation. No accusations, just facts. And when those facts reached the right people, the city council, the district attorney, even a few hesitant media outlets, something shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't just my voice anymore. It was a chorus. And I realized they weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of what I represented. A woman who didn't flinch. A survivor who didn't stay silent. A therapist who treated her own wounds by exposing theirs. I hadn't just lit a fire. I'd taught others how to hold the match. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing they never tell you about justice. It doesn't show up like a cavalry. It leaks in quietly, precisely, until it saturates everything. The first crack came when the city suspended 2 inspectors, both linked to buildings owned by Northgate. One of them signed off on my clinic's final report, the one that declared the building structurally compromised, just 1 day before the fire. Next came the investors. Derek's series had reached national news. Headlines started showing up in places that usually ignored people like me. Words like embezzlement, cover-up, and religious land laundering were suddenly trending. And shareholders don't like headlines. Northgate's parent company took a hit. Then another. Then the board released a statement. It was vague, defensive, predictable. But what stood out was the last line. They announced the temporary suspension of Pastor Caleb Reynolds, pending an internal review. I read it twice. Then I sat down. Because for all the months I'd been fighting, I hadn't expected that moment to feel so quiet. There were no fireworks, no courtroom verdict. Just an email from a press office. But something in me shifted. Because I knew this wasn't the end. But it was a beginning. Caleb called me that night. He didn't say hello. Didn't ask how I was. He just said, "Are you satisfied?" I let the silence answer for me. Then I whispered, "You were never going to stop until someone stopped you." He exhaled like a man who finally realized the walls had closed in. And for once, he had nowhere to hide. I didn't need to say anything else. I hung up. And for the first time since the fire, I slept. The installation stayed open another month. Visitors kept showing up. Survivors brought their families. Parents brought their teenage daughters. Reporters, lawyers, even a few cautious church leaders who admitted off the record that they'd ignored warning signs for years. We didn't win a war, but we lit a fuse. And when that spark caught fire in the right place, the system began to melt. Some people called me a hero. Some called me a liability. But I didn't care. Because the people who mattered, they called me what I had always wanted to be called. Safe. It's strange what you remember when the world stops spinning. Not the big things. Not the fire. Not the money. Not even the headlines. No. What I remember is the laugh. That first one. The one that slipped out the night my father called, telling me my building was gone. It wasn't joy. It wasn't madness either. It was recognition. The moment I realized the life I had built wasn't the one I was meant to keep. That laugh. It was the sound of something breaking free. A year later, I stood on the edge of the construction site where my building used to be. But it wasn't rubble anymore. It was rising. A new foundation, new walls, new purpose. Built not by developers in suits, but by a coalition of survivors, organizers, artists, and advocates. We named it The Haven, a community space for healing, for speaking, for those who were once silenced. Inside would be a small counseling center, a resource library, an emergency shelter, and a permanent exhibition room, Sanctuary Burned, in its final, unaltered form. My father stood beside me that day, sipping burnt coffee, staring at the blueprint in his hands. "You really did it," he said. I looked at him, this man who once begged me to stay quiet, to stay safe, to stay small. He wasn't that man anymore. Not since he'd joined me in the fire. "Correction," I said, "we did it." He smiled. Then he handed me a folder. Inside were new documents, financial statements, names, property filings. A development group suspiciously similar to Northgate had just purchased a historic building across town. Same shell companies, same permits, same timing. I looked up. "You want to keep going?" He shrugged. "It's not about revenge anymore. It's about patterns." I laughed. "You sound like me." He raised an eyebrow. "No, I sound like someone who's finally paying attention." And I realized this wasn't just my story. It never had been. It was my client's. It was the families that fled in silence. It was the whistleblowers who risked everything to speak. It was Derek, who kept writing even when his job was on the line. It was Sophia, who opened her gallery to something raw and uncomfortable and didn't flinch. It was my father, who taught me logic and then rediscovered his heart. And yes, it was even Caleb. Because without him, I may never have found the fire inside me. But this isn't a redemption arc. He didn't change. He didn't apologize. He didn't break down crying in court and beg for forgiveness. He denied everything until the very end. And that's fine. Because this story was never about him.
It was about what we built in spite of him.
The truth is, I still don't know if justice is ever complete. People still whisper. Institutions still protect themselves. Survivors still hesitate. But I've learned something I never expected. Justice isn't always a courtroom. Sometimes it's a gallery full of strangers who cry at the sight of a melted cabinet. Sometimes it's a father showing up with spreadsheets and saying, "Where do we start?" Sometimes it's silence finally broken. And sometimes it's just one voice refusing to be erased. If you've made it this far with me, thank you. I don't know your story, but I know what it feels like to lose everything and still be standing. I know what it means to scream and have no one hear you. And I know the power of someone finally listening. So if you're listening now, don't look away. Not from the pain, not from the patterns, not from the fire. Because the truth is, what tried to burn you down might just be what lights your path. And maybe, just maybe, what feels like the end of everything is the start of who you were always meant to be. Take care of yourself. And if no one else has said it lately, I believe you.